particularly the first four items on here, like I do with people who don't know anything about the monetary system. The final three go a little bit beyond that. Let's see, I have to advance the slides, so I have to stand back here. Okay, so these are the questions I'm going to address. What is money? Who creates it? How's the money created? And then the big picture, and then how are banks different from other lending institutions, and what's the role of the central bank in money creation by commercial banks, and how would it all be different under a sovereign money system? So it's a big job for 30 minutes.
Exactly.
Okay, here it is. Okay, so the first question is, what is money? And of course, what money is largely account money. People tend to think of dollar bills and coins, and so this is an enormous hurdle to overcome for them to realize that those bills and coins represent a trivial fraction of the total amount of money in circulation. But all you have to do is remind them, do you get paid with dollar bills? Do you pay your utility bills with dollar bills? They all, no. And they soon become to realize that, yeah, account money is where it is. It has little to do with bills and coins. Okay, let's see. So money is created all the time. This is the data from the feds, and it simply shows this rise in the money supply. This happens to be the M2 money stock. So over $750 billion has been created within the last year. Okay, so money is being created all the time. And this is account money. This is not dollar bills and coins. Okay, so then the question is, well, who creates this money? And I always give this multiple choice question to groups. So I say, well, how many of you think that the government, perhaps the Treasury Department, creates the money? I get a few hands coming up. How many think the Federal Reserve does? And I get a few hands coming up. How many think the commercial bank, the banks, create money? I even get a few hands coming up there, even in naive groups. But most of the hands come up for D, okay? Which is a good introduction because that's where I was 7 years ago too, so I'm sort of with them. Okay. But the answer to the question is, if the government created money, why would it be in debt? Why would it borrow it? And the government does create some money. It creates the coins in your pocket, but that's trivial, and that's all it creates, okay? Federal Reserve, that's more complicated. The Federal Reserve can and has created money in a sense, although it does so indirectly. But in fact, the big money creation by the Federal Reserve stopped in 2014 with the termination of quantitative easing. So even the Federal Reserve System is not a major contributor in a direct way to the money supply that we have, the M2. The answer is the banks. So how on earth do banks create money? People have a hard time believing that they can just create money. How do they do that? Well, in order to understand that, you have to understand a bank balance sheet. And the bank balance sheet consists of two halves. The left half is assets, the right half is liabilities. The assets are what the bank owns and what is owed to the banks. And you can see what that is. That consists of the cash they have in the vault of their currency, some central reserves, and all central reserves mean is that every bank has a bank account. Banks have bank accounts with central banks. You and I have bank accounts with banks, okay? But the money that the banks have is kept in the central bank. It's their bank account, okay? Also, they have illiquid assets, namely loans out to customers. It's illiquid because they don't have immediate access to that money. They have to wait till it's paid back in accordance with the loan schedules that have been established. So that's the assets of the bank. Liabilities are what the bank owes. That's customer deposits and stockholder equity, or capital it's sometimes called. So let's take a look at a bank loan. What happens here? Bank loan here is Jack takes out a $10,000 loan. Here's the new information that's entered on the bank balance sheet. So the bank has a $10,000 liability to Jack because Jack's going to take that money. Okay, they're loaning it to him, so now he's got to have access to that money. So that's a liability that they establish. But they have an equal asset that's established because Jack's going to have to pay that money back. Okay, so they're going to increase the columns in both the assets and liabilities by the amount of the loan. Okay. Now, let's say Jack buys a car, because he's not going to just leave that money in the bank. He's going to use it. So he's going to take that money out. Okay. So he takes that money out. He writes a check on his account that now has that $10,000 in it. He gives that check to Sam because Sam's going to sell him the car, okay? And now Sam takes that check and back to his bank. And assume for a minute they both bank at the same bank. So Sam takes that check, deposits in his account. What does the bank do? It simply transfers then money, numbers in computers, from Jack's account, had the $10,000 there, to Sam's account. Okay? So the bank has transferred the money from the one account to the other. So now they have no more liability to Jack because he's flattened his account, and they got a $10,000 liability to Sam because Sam just sold his car. He gets $10,000. Okay? Assets stay the same. Jack's still got to pay back the loan. Okay? Now, what if Sam banks at a different bank? That's a more common situation, obviously. Well, then what Sam does is he takes that check to his bank. Okay? And the bank takes that check and says, oh, we've got to transfer some money here, just like in the previous case, but now it's a transfer between banks. And since each bank has a bank account with a central bank, it turns out this check clearing, the clearinghouse function of the Federal Reserve basically says, oh yeah, we have to transfer $10,000 of money from Jack's bank to Sam's bank. So reserves get transferred, and that's the clearinghouse function of central banks. Okay? So the banking system basically acts like one big bank. Now, this is a figure that probably many of you here are familiar with from an important paper published in the quarterly bulletin of the Bank of England, and it illustrates this. I wish I had a pointer here. I don't, and I can't wander over there because the videographer won't let me. But you can see on the left third of this, two banks are represented. Okay, the buyer's bank is on the left, and the seller's bank is on the right, and they're represented as having equal reserves and equal currency and deposits. So what you can see is the green is the reserves. That's the bank's bank account with the central bank, and they have some currency in the vault and so on. So they're both alike, but the buyer's bank is now going to create a loan. So what you see is in the central portion there, that bank creates a new deposit for the borrower, okay, and that's a new asset for the bank, namely the loan, okay. So now the money is taken out because the person is going to buy a house or whatever they're going to do with that loan money, and what you can see is they deposit once the check or the electronic transfer, whatever happens, that new deposit there is going to be taken out of that bank and put into the seller's bank. Okay, so now you can see that there's a new deposit in the seller's bank here. All right, and what the central bank does is it transfers the reserves, and you can see that indicated by this arrow here. And what that means, and this is important for you to understand, what that means is the buyer's bank now has given a new loan. That's illiquid money. So the reserves of that bank have gone down, okay? That's why my banker says, I don't create money, I just take it out of a pre-existing source. I take it out of that column, and now what was reserves is now a loan. But of course the question is, the increase in money has occurred in the other bank, into which the deposit has been made. So in fact, what the buyer's bank did was create new money that did not end up in his hands, but ended up in the hands of the other bank. Okay, so there's a new deposit, and the money supply is basically the deposits in banks. Okay, so that's the red column over there. So the money supply is the same over there in both banks. Okay. But now you can see that the money supply has increased by the amount of the new deposit. So that's the money creation step. Now, this is what's interesting. If you follow this with a number of sequential loans, you can see the process of money supply increasing. So start over there on the left, Bank A and Bank B. And so Bank A is going to make a loan, and just as in our previous case, it's going to end up being deposited in Bank B. Those blue blocks now are basically units then of money. Okay, so what you can see is I'm going to go point to this. Then I'll be back.
No, yes, fine.
Okay, so what you can see is that the bank balance has gone up in this bank because it received this money, this deposit, okay? And now, let's say that bank makes a loan, and that loan gets deposited back in Bank A, okay? Now you can see money is going to be transferred back into Bank A, okay? Now there's another loan that goes the other direction, and 4 of these loans. And now let's count up the money supply, okay? The money supply is in fact the deposits, those are the liabilities in the bank. So initially what we had was 2 in Bank A and 2 in Bank B. After 4 loans, we get 4 in Bank A and 4 in Bank B. We've doubled the money supply with 4 loans. Even my banker, when I told him this, has finally understood that he creates money when he makes loans. But it took this figure to do it. Okay, so the big picture here, of course, is that the money supply that we have is created by banks making loans. Then that money is going back into the financial sector as these loans get repaid. Okay? So as long as the lending stays ahead of or is equal to the payback, it looks like this system ought to work fine. No problems. Okay? We'd have money in the system and that's hunky-dory. All right. But of course there are potential problems. One of the problems is that occasionally funny things happen in the world and people get less willing to borrow because they're less confident of the future, and banks are less willing to loan because they're less confident of the ability of people to pay back the loans that they take. So lending slows down, but after all, the repayment has already been pre-scheduled, so that has to continue. So what we have now is more money being taken out of the economy than is being put in. Money supply shrinks, and it's virtually the definition of a recession or a depression, when the money supply shrinks. Okay? So problem number 2, of course, is that the bank created the principal, which gets paid back, but the bank wants the interest too. And so the question is, where does that come from? Now, if you think microeconomics, as my banker does when I talk with him, he says, "Oh, it's no problem. You just take another job. You know, that's the way the world works." But think about the whole system. Where does the system get the money to pay the interest? Okay, it's hard for people to get their mind wrapped around that question. But the fact is, the answer to that question is, there's only one source for new money. Where is it? More loans. Okay, because that's where all the money comes from. So what that means is, every loan demands another loan. Here's a thought experiment. It's oversimplified, and my banker didn't like it, but nonetheless it's true. Imagine that you started out an economy or with a $100 loan or a $100 billion loan, whatever you want to call it, okay? And you had an arrangement that at the end of that period of time, you would pay back that loan, okay? No payments in between, just balloon payment at the end, okay? So you go back to pay the $100, and the banker says, "Yeah, but I want $110 because there's interest here, okay, 10% interest." And you say, well, I want to keep this $100 in the economy, so I need to make another loan, take out another loan of $100, $100 billion, whatever. Okay, so why don't I borrow $110 billion, and that way I can pay you that 10 bucks, that 10 billion right now, to cover the cost of that preceding loan, okay? And so we'll be golden for another year. At the end of that year, what happens? At the end of that year, well, another loan, that loan comes due, you scrape up all the money, you take it back to the banker, and the bank says, "Yeah, but I want 110, I want 100, and well, in order to take out the second loan now, you have to take out $110, and then at the end of it, there's going to be another 10% due. 10% is going to be $11, which means you got to pay back $121. Anyway, what you can see is each one of these increases in this way, and it essentially describes an exponential curve. It's the nature of compound interest, basically. And that essentially parallels, that parallels the curve that you saw earlier that represents the money supply. It's the same curve. It's the exponential rise. Okay, but wait a minute, somebody argues, where does those interest payments go? They don't go just into heaven, you know, they got to go somewhere. And the question is, don't those interest payments get fed back into the economy too? And the answer is yes, in part. But the whole point is that where those interest payments are going are to people who don't spend the same fraction of their income on groceries as the rest of the world does. So those people who are getting the money in the financial sector are going to save it or invest it, okay? What does that mean? Well, it means it's going into the stock market. And look what's happened to the stock market now. It's record highs. So that's what we have when you have this sort of process going on, is the money is skimmed off by the financial sector and it goes into this creation of sort of fake wealth in the stock market, which has little to do with the real wealth in the economy. My banker says, wait a minute, the interest that I get, I pay my salary, I pay salaries for my people and so on. Again, he's looking at it from a microeconomic point of view, but we have more conversations to have. Okay, so in a debt money supply system, to keep a constant money supply in the economy, the total money supply rises exponentially as the money is filtered off into the financial sector. And the steepness of the rise is primarily a function of interest rates. Okay? So money creation by banks is a process by which wealth is systematically transferred from the many, the borrowers, to the lenders, the few. And here's an example of that. This is a figure from Leiter's book, Money and Sustainability, and it's taken, and what you can see is the transfer of money as a function of interest payments. This was a study that was done back in Germany, and the study has, to my knowledge, not been repeated since then, and it should be repeated by some economists. But what it shows is these various deciles of the population, from the lowest on the left to the highest on the right. And you can see the direction of flow of money as a function of interest payments. They go from the bottom 80% to the top 20%. And what we really know, most of it goes to the top 1%. Now, there's an interesting figure in Elizabeth Warren's book, This Fight is Our Fight. And this is one of two figures, similar figures that she has. And what it is a distribution of new income between 1935 and 1980. And as you can see, the top 10% were receiving 30% of all income growth. What that means is the bottom 90% were receiving 70% of all income growth. And the other figure that she has, which I do not show here, what that figure shows is since 1980, the top 10% get 100% of the income growth. The bottom 90% get 0 of the income growth. So she looks at this and says, we got to return to this because this really looks good compared to that. She's right. But what's happening even here with all these progressive fiscal policies that were introduced during this historical period, Social Security, the GI Bill, Medicare, on, high taxes for the very wealthy, even despite that, what we were getting is concentration of wealth into the fewer and fewer hands. So maybe fiscal policy is not enough to deal with this problem. Maybe monetary reform should be considered. Well, how do banks differ from other lending institutions? We've seen this flow of money from lending, but you and I lend money, and other institutions besides banks lend money. But only depository institutions, namely banks, where you can deposit money, only these institutions create money. Okay? But lenders, including banks, do face these constraints to lending. So on the left here, you have the assets and liabilities of a given bank or lender. And what you can see on the left, we'll start with just pure reserves. Okay, so they've got this liquid money. On the right, it must be a bank because they got deposits and they got E for equity. Okay, so they make some loans, and now they're cash or reserve. And these two terms I'm using equally here, although that's a little confusing, but some people use it one way and some the other. So, and anyway, their liquid money goes down. Oops.
And the computer system also goes down.
Okay.
Windows updates, thank you, Windows.
That's all right. It's 30% complete.
That was during your presentation, not mine.
You will not argue with Windows.
We will not. But You know,
No,
I'm getting toward the
Windows have a-
end of the talk anyway. Give me one of those copies of handouts that I had so I can remind myself of what I was going to say next. Thanks, Sergio. Okay, so.
Change your settings.
So some of you have these handouts already, and I can just essentially use them. The point I want to make here is that as banks make loans, their liquid assets do decrease. So if they were not getting deposits in, they could come to a point where they couldn't make any more loans because they didn't have any more liquid assets. They would have a liquidity problem, okay? But any lender can borrow. So what banks do and other lenders do is they borrow money to be able to continue lending. And as long as they can borrow at a lower rate than they can lend, they're golden, they continue. So, and the question then is, what limits the ability of lenders to borrow? And for non-banks, the answer to that is the markets. That is to say, if they can still borrow at low enough rates so they can lend higher and make money, they'll do it. But if they can't, then that limits essentially what they can do. Banks, on the other hand, have a trump card, and the trump card is the central bank. So when the banking system runs out of liquidity, that can be supplied then by the central bank. And so the central bank can, when it's necessary, loan to loan to banks, okay? And of course, they did this big time in 2008. So what the central bank does is it makes loans. When it makes loans to banks, it does it just like the banks make loans to you and me. It has a bank balance sheet in the central bank that looks just like the bank balance sheet in any bank. And what happens is that they create money, the central bank, so their bank statements rise, both assets and liabilities, as they create new, quote, reserves for the commercial banks. That new reserve is now a new asset, a liquid asset, for the commercial banks that allow them to continue lending. So that's the difference between bank lenders and non-bank lenders. There are really two differences. One is that the banks have this trump card of being able to borrow from the central banks, and nobody else can, okay? And two, banks have deposits, your checking account and mine, and other non-bank lenders don't have that, okay? So these are the two things, advantages essentially in terms of lending that banks have, that makes them unique. So in conclusion, just what I want to say, so I'll fit in my 30 minutes, it's pretty good, is what I say to audiences is simply that the way we create money has an enormous impact on all of us, because it is responsible, perhaps primarily so, for the transfer of wealth from the many to the few, because every dollar that we use has been loaned. That's the only source. So that means of all the money that's out there that you and I are just using for our daily transaction, interest is being paid on this because it was taken out as a loan from banks. This is an enormous expense to the economy, which would not have to be the case at all if, in fact, the government were creating the money system that we use. After all, the money system is sort of, the money is the infrastructure for the economy, just like roads are the infrastructure for transportation. And it should be produced, essentially that infrastructure needs to be produced by the people through its government in order to make the system work without some special interest sucking off the profits from this very thing that's essential to the central operation of our economy. So what I would ask people to think about is this possibility of having government-created money instead of privately created money should be a part of our national conversation now as to how to address this enormous set of problems that we face of how to pay for infrastructure, how to pay for healthcare, how to pay for education. There is a way, because money should not be scarce, and if government is creating money, it can get past that scarcity of money. Thank you.